Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Robert Fry and AJ Ferrara. And today we have on Ben Franks. I met Ben back when I was with Emergence and became familiar with his work there. I got super excited because you were doing gaze behavior when I first got to know about you. And I was super excited because with baseball, gaze behavior stuff with hitting was kind of in vogue, you could say at that point in time. And it was really awesome to hear your talk at the Sport Movement Skill Conference. And then you spoke again this year, and I got even more excited because you were talking about cricket, and that was even closer to the sport that we're all very much interested in, which is baseball. So I wanted to have you on to kind of dive more into your presentation and kind of there was one specific question too that Sean actually asked you that also got me very intrigued because we want to. I'm very much trying to figure out, like, okay, how do these ideas practically work with like in their practical application? And so, there's a lot of controversy about information processing versus like an ecological approach and the different ways that we do practice design and all that sort of stuff. And so now that hearing a little bit about, how you've kind of gone more from a researcher to being a little bit more closely on the field, I kind of want to hear a little bit more about your story. So to start off, Ben, you kind of want to give us a little introduction of like who you are, because I bet a lot of people in the baseball world are not super familiar with who is Ben Franks.
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
Yeah, I'm terrible at these. So I guess my job now is a senior lecturer in applied coaching sciences at Oxford Brookes University. It's a bit of a made up job title. I teach some skill acquisition stuff and some coaching stuff and some performance analysis bits. And then as part of that, kind of my role as a researcher within this kind of broader ecological space. My PhD specifically is looking at skilled intentionality within cricket, as you said, which is just a much longer, slightly more tedious version of baseball, but you get like lots of like lunch and teas over a period of 5 days, which is quite nice. But yeah, and then I've always tried to kind of remain quite close to the field and quite close to coaching, and no, it's always been quite a big part of the work I try to do, and it was within my research is to make it as real and as close to the context as possible, and that's kind of generated my interest in kind of gaze behavior research, particularly with the quiet eye initially, and now more broadly in visual search behaviors. It's just because it's such a nice way to look at kind of real natural behaviors in environments that as closely replicate what people do in the performance context as much as possible. And it all kind of stemmed from my master's, which was what I first presented on at the Emergence conference a while back, the SMC conference, which looked at goalkeepers' use of visual search behaviors again in various different kind of conditions and environments, which were like increasingly representative to the performance environment. And yeah, just like the real kind of messy reality of that, what I found really interesting, and the challenges along the way of trying to do real world research. And yeah, just finding some really cool stuff, and kind of off the back of that, publishing that a couple of years ago now, kind of linked to that broader ecological sense around like the fact that there is some variability, that there is some kind of unique signatures as such in how people engage with like the visual information out there in the world, and how that then impacts movement patterns and all that kind of broader stuff. So yeah, I'm actually not coaching anymore. Up until December, I was very much someone who tried to be practical, but I've stepped back from kind of practical coaching stuff to become a proper researcher for a little bit, and to see if I can actually do some research and finish my PhD and actually get some projects off the ground rather than trying to do 1,000 different things.
I guess for me, I think maybe a good place to start is one, and I'm going to put two questions together. One, the question that Sean asked you, and then I think it ties well with, and so the question was how has your views of ecological dynamics have changed over time? How has it been honed, or I think honed is the right word. And then how did you like what is um, ecological dynamics to you? Like, I think, how did you get into it? I think is really the question that I want to ask there is how did you get into ecological dynamics? And then how has that changed over time now that you've done a master's and now you're teaching and going for your PhD?
Yeah, so I come across it during my undergraduate. I was quite fortunate to have Will Roberts and Danny Newcomb as my two lecturers, who obviously wrote the latest edition of the Constrained Approach book with Ian Renshaw and Keith Davids. So I was really fortunate in that sense to work really closely with them for the 3 years of my undergraduate, and then Will Roberts supervised my masters. Then Danny employed me at the university initially. So yeah, I was really fortunate to work really closely with those guys, and they signposted me towards that stuff. And I probably then, like, they're super applied, Will and Danny. Like, their ability to apply this stuff is phenomenal. And I probably took a more truer sense to the theory side of things rather than always like being super super practical. I was way more interested in like the mechanics that underpin direct perception and stuff like that. So I kind of ran that way a little bit more. And then that's kind of shaped my views to I try to locate myself more in ecological psychology rather than ecological dynamics. Just because of, I guess, obviously the massive, huge debates that go on all over Twitter and around ecological approaches and more traditional approaches, or kind of meshed approaches, or 4E approach, whatever it is, and that kind of space, and there are some fair challenges of ecological dynamics. So, and obviously my PhD supervisor currently kind of pushed me more towards the traditional ecological psychology sort of things, and like dealing with like real life information kind of stuff and the perception of proper information. So I probably drifted more towards ecological psychology over the last few years and away from ecological dynamics. But that was more just the progress of my PhD, which led me down that path. And I think ecological dynamics is still a really useful theoretical framework for coaches. But there is some messiness, and there's some bits that have been cherry picked at times, and it doesn't always. There's some contemporary issues which are being solved gradually, just because it's a very new theory. Which isn't to discredit the theory. I think that's really beneficial that it's gone through that evolution over the last couple of years. But it's probably why I've drifted more towards kind of eco-psych, and also where I'm a perception researcher. It fits better. For a lack of me a little bit, I'd worry less about the movement patterns that underpin it, which obviously what ecological dynamics has its strengths in from a dynamic systems perspective.
And Ben, you talk a little bit about it. Some of the differences between ecological psychology and ecological dynamics. In your experience these past few years, what are some things within ecological psychology that you've kind of uncovered or thought about in a different way than, say, when you were on the side of ecological dynamics?
I think that the key one is the treatment of the treatment of information that we perceive. I think in ecological psychology, it obviously still has its more traditional roots within the mathematics of it all, which isn't massively my strength. But I feel like from a research perspective, I do think it's much more powerful in that sense, in truly understanding what information is specifying and which information is lawful to behavior. Whereas ecological dynamics is kind of at times just lumped information together as specifying and non-specifying, and doesn't always treat the underlying bits of it, but more just because it rests on the assumptions of ecological psychology. It's not necessarily that it doesn't care about it, it's more just resting on those traditional assumptions.
Can you, on that point, go into a little bit more depth on the specifying versus non-specifying? That was something that you had talked about at SMSC that personally I saw had a lot of carryover to the hitting side of baseball. So would love to hear a general overview of how you bucket those things, what goes into it for the audience.
So I think if I use my PhD as the example, the specifying information will be things like the ball flight, things that are lawfully like bound to action. So if you think about some of the more traditional work, like Dave Lee's work in kind of steering when driving and looking at things like time to contact and the variable of tau, tau describes that time to contact, and it's an information variable which is kind of lawful in the sense that it specifies a relation between the observer and the environment. So we can perceive the rate of expansion of an object on the retina, which is like a lawful way of treating that information because it leads to specific behavior. So in cricket, the flight of the ball towards the batter is very much a specifying source of information because it is leading to an action. Whereas a non-specifying information source might be something like the broader like contextual environment around it. It might be the line of the run-up of the bowler. It might be the slight variations in their action within their hands. So in cricket, different kind of, and similar to baseball, right? Different hand positions, finger positions can impart different trajectories on the ball, different rates of spin, different speed. It can make it swing. All of those are more non-specifying sources of information because they're not going to tell us directly how to act. It's not going to necessarily allow me to intercept the ball in its path, but it's going to get me in a state of kind of action readiness. So the way that we're treating that in my PhD is that the use of non-specifying information allows the individual to keep open as many possible affordances as possible. It's like puts us into this like state of action readiness. So it, for cricket batters, it brings them into the line of the ball, or it might inform of the variation of the ball that's going to be bowled. So cricket ball normally has a shinier side and a rougher side, just where the bowlers will try to protect one side of the ball so that it can be much smoother. And that's then going to create a bit of lateral movement in the swing of the ball. And slight variations in how the seam that runs through the middle of the ball, variations in how that seam is positioned within the grip of the bowler, can then kind of cause the seam to hit the ground at slightly different angles, and it might start to nip up towards them, or be a little bit flatter in the carry through, or swing more. Like they're all like non-specifying bits of information. Those kind of grips on the ball. It's just informing the batter of a state of action that might occur in the future. So it just brings them closer into line with potentially, not another word expected, but like potentially expected outcomes. So as a batter, I mean, I'm a terrible batter. I'm dreadful. This is why I do research in it rather than doing it. I know that if I'm facing a bowler at my local cricket club, where the wickets are normally they're not the best in the world. They're normally quite soft. There's a bit of a hill. So I know if I'm facing a bowler who's coming down the hill, it's always cloudy where I am. So it's going to be quite overcast. So I know that the likelihood is that ball is going to swing away from me a little bit. And I'll try and pick it in the bowler's hand, and I'll try and pick for their variations in finger positions and the seam position. I'm pretty poor at it. But I should be able to, I'm going to start to think that this is probably going to swing away from me and swing away from the stumps. So chances are I'm going to be playing lots of shots into the offside, trying to pick those ones out over there. So I might bring myself I might shuffle my feet a little bit more. I might move towards the line of the ball that I think it's going to be on, but it's not going to specifically cause me to do the action of intercepting the ball. That comes much later on in that in the event, when specifying information becomes available through the trajectory of the ball, and like more lawful variables like time to contact come into play.
So when you say something is non-specifying, it can still be relevant. But how do you also deal with like information that is not relevant? Because even to me, so when you describe tau seems to me to be like a higher order variable, right? Would that be a fair? Okay. And so if that's the case, that it's a higher order variable, can there be other specifying information that's like lower order? So for example, being able to pick up the hand position or the release point, to me that is specifying, but it's not like you're saying like it doesn't have a lawful thing. But if I can't pick up that point, I won't be able to follow, or I'll have to pick up the trajectory of the ball further down its flight path. And that's if I am able to figure that out. And so to me, there's something about, you also need to be attuned and sensitive enough to be able to pick up where the release point is, so that you can actually follow the ball flight. And so I guess that's where I'm kind of interested to know, like, how do these other variables how do you delineate variables that are like not even relevant at all? You could say crowd noise, like that doesn't have that. If you're attuning to that, or you're letting that affect you, that's completely non-specifying. Whereas something like the bowler's run up, that has information that's useful, but it doesn't have that lawfulness necessarily. But even still, like, I think it tells you when going back to what you're talking about before, action readiness, right? You have to start, it gives you information of when to start moving, to put yourself in a position to be able to actually respond to that later information. So I guess, is that what you're meaning by action readiness? Is that you are acting in such a way to prepare yourself for the subsequent event or things that are about to unfold?
Yeah, like non-specifying doesn't necessarily mean like not informative. It's just not lawful. So I think that's where ecological psychology, I think, treats information more clearly, in the sense that like ecological psychology is the study of ecological like relations and the study of information within that environment. So the job of ecological psychology is to find the lawful information variables which are specifying of action and like we can perceive directly. So we perceive things like tau directly. It's a lawful information variable. The point around crowd noise is an interesting one, because like we don't know that it's not informative. So most teams have a better home record than they do have an away record, and that's probably something to do with things like the crowd. We saw in the UK, especially, like, my main sport is football. As much as my research is in cricket, like my interest has always been in football, soccer in this context. But during COVID, when there was no crowds, like the home and away kind of records kind of leveled out a little bit more. So the crowd, I think, might actually be part of skilled behaviour, the fact that we're able to deal with a crowd, whatever. So my PhD is essentially around that point, is how we couple the use of like specifying and non-specifying information, because there's so much of it. And almost like the treatment of something like cricket, rather than it being like a series of discrete events, like ball one, ball two, ball three, it's just one continuous temporal event. Every ball corresponds to the ball before it and the ball that comes after, because those events are so nested in our relations with the environment. So how I'm batting, how I'm perceiving, how I've attuned to the environment at the start of my innings might look very different to the middle and to the end, and compared to when it's 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon to 4:30 in the late afternoon, compared to if we've got, runs on the board, or we've lost loads of wickets, or the weather's changing a little bit, or like all those different information sources they're non-specifying, but they can still be informative. They are still like shaping our relations with the environment. And that essentially that state of action readiness is we used or more skilled individuals will use that non-specifying information, i.e. like pre-ball release kinematics, might use it more successfully, and it might do a better job of bringing them in line with the ball. Like the ball moves way too fast for us to rely solely on like trajectory information alone. So we have to do something which brings us in line or closer in line to in that batting performance. So as you'll see, most like individuals will start triggering that movement, particularly goalkeepers in my master's work. The goalkeepers are often moving before the ball has been struck. So obviously that kind of non-specifying information is causing some behaviors to change. It's maybe not the most informed decision because it's not relying necessarily on like ball trajectory information, but it's still something which is allowing us to anticipate the future state of that event. So with batting in particular, like that anticipation can come from things like the run-up, information we know about the bowler. We might know that the bowler likes to bowl certain variations at certain times in the innings and that kind of stuff. And it just brings me into this state of action readiness, which is where I'm just trying to keep the landscape of affordances as open as possible, or as like kind of solicited as possible towards the kind of expected outcome of those events. Just helping the batter keep in line with future events, and that almost that kind of like allowing them to access more specifying information sources through the use of non-specifying information sources by bringing them into that state of action readiness, so they're more able to then make use of the affordances further down the line of that event.
Are there many other specifying sources of information other than, you could say, like Tau?
Yeah, there's smatterings of them all over the shop. There is, I'm going to get the names wrong of these as well. There's a lot done in fly ball catching, particularly by Claire Michaels in like the 80s, I think, around like perceiving like vertical optical acceleration or something like that. That's not exact. Mm-hmm. That's not the exact term, I'm sure. There are other variables, but I guess the difficulty in these variables is in accessing them as well. Is like the maths behind them is crazy half the time. There was some work a while, about 10 years ago, I think, around affordance-based control and how we make use of affordances in line with kind of knowledge of our own action capabilities and our own effectivities, and how kind of lawful information can be used in respect to those effectivities. And so there's bits and pieces out there, but I guess that's more specifically the role of ecological psychology, is around understanding those information variables compared to ecological dynamics, which I guess is more geared towards, certainly more towards sport-based contexts in particular, and it's probably more an applied theoretical framework to understand those interactions in a sporting context. So probably less worried about the different information variables used and more worried about kind of the broader context around affordance use in sport.
And you talked a little bit about, the non-specificity of crowd control and whatnot. So I want to go to a football example and talk about how for Liverpool's home games, the crowd does "You'll Never Walk Alone" to sing. And so, and I know in other sports, like in baseball in the States, the common thing that coaches will tell minor leaguers is never look up, because the crowd size is never above, 2 decks high at most. And then when you look up, the bright lights. So in terms of, ecological psychology, how can something like that, where maybe there is a notorious home field advantage, or there's a notorious place you're going to that's well known, how does that affect, someone's, performance in terms of ecological psychology?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's necessarily even an ecological psychology perspective on it. It's just kind of the more traditional stuff on arousal and kind of state anxiety and stuff, and the biological effect that can be had on the performer as well, and the kind of increase in heart rate, and like that stuff is affecting that broader complex system that humans are, and kind of that's going to change the relations we have with the environment. And I don't know the exact relations that crowd's going to change on how we perceive stuff. There's likely, I think, a broader neurobiological response we have to stressors, and that's going to affect how we then pick up information. I think there's a fair hypothesis we can lean on, which I think underpins kind of ecological psychology, and particularly the biological relations that inform our interactions and kind of our broader complex system that we are and are linked to as well.
I wanted to loop back just a little bit. Can you kind of explain what is direct perception? Because you brought up, that we can't necessarily maybe track the ball the whole way if it's going super fast because it's moving faster than our eyes can follow. And then, how does direct perception differ, or maybe how can it be coincided with this, information processing, how long it takes, the information to travel from the eye to the brain and then from the brain to the spinal cord. Like how do you view this stuff? And then also like, how does direct perception play into all this?
So direct perception is like, I'd probably say is like the strict starting point of any kind of ecological approach to perception. And that kind of stems from Gibson's really early work. And direct perception is literally how we perceive the environment directly. There's no need for any kind of mediating or kind of broader mental gymnastics or kind of inferential processes within the brain to kind of process that sensory data into something more meaningful. Gibson's whole argument was that the world out there is meaningful in itself, like the environment that we're surrounded by, like has meaning within it. So like as we are walking in a straight line down a path, information kind of like the visual scene rushes past us. And that perception of optic flow is what specifies motion. And that is supposedly, or is argued, is a direct information variable which we pick up on. So we are surrounded by this optic array, just that light reflecting off of all number of surfaces, and that can specify kind of depth and occluded surfaces. So as I'm sat here now, I've got a lamp on in the corner, and like that projects that light into the room, and it creates a very littered kind of optic array. And I've got like a chair there, and the end of the sofa there, the door there, and I can now pick up all the different objects or bits of furniture within the room. That's the optic array which I'm trying to perceive. And as I move, the visual scene will always change, and it's the relation I have with that environment which is important. The direct perception, therefore, then specifies that the information out there which is causing me to act, we are kind of innately sensitive to, in the sense that it is lawfully specifying of action. So my behavior is controlled by the perception of kind of very real material information sources, which I attune to or calibrate to, which informs our perception. So there was loads of work done on like looming objects in babies and how babies can respond to how objects loom towards them. There's some wicked work from, I think it's like 1981 from, I think it was Bootsma and Savelsberg and someone else. I can't remember for the life of me. But they literally examined kind of whether we are sensitive to objects kind of looming towards us, kind of growing and like the rate of expansion. And they got like a mechanical arm and a load of balls which flew towards the face of the perceiver. And they had to kind of grab the ball as it came towards them on this mechanical arm. And they measured like the grip aperture. So like the aperture in the hand. And they sent one ball down, which was like a large size ball, and it stayed large the whole time. They did one with a smaller ball, which stayed small the whole time. And they did one with a ball that deflated as it went down, to see whether we are actually sensitive to the rate of change in an object relative to kind of as it's moving towards us, so we can actually perceive rate of expansion. And it was evidence that like the aperture in the hand changed relative to the deflating ball as it came towards them. So they'd argue that we are sensitive to that information source. It's a lawfully specifying source of information which has a consequence of action. Whereas more traditional theories in psychology lean really heavily on representation, so like more forms of indirect perception. The world is just like a collection of lights which kind of comes into the retina, and it's just meaningless sense data which we need to make sense of, and there has to be some process in the brain which knits and stitches that picture together to make it therefore meaningful for the person perceiving it. And I think a lot of it stems from like the fact that the reflection within the eye of light comes backwards, and therefore like the brain has to do something to like flip the image as well, and the brain has to do something to stop it being a collection of still images like an old school like movie tape. So there has to be a process in the brain which is doing that stuff, and that's where information processing kind of and that stemmed from, and now more towards like active inference and more contemporary representational theories have come from, in the sense that I think most people have like disregarded information processing now. I think even kind of most hardline cognitivists are now pre-accepting that's not really a thing, and we're more towards kind of active inference and predictive processing and meshed control, or kind of the Friston brigade of like the 4E kind of stuff. But the difference is still based around the use of representations within cognition, perception, and action. And ecological psychology is still really hard line of the fact that no representation is needed because we are directly sensitive to information out there. Whereas there is still that kind of band of cognitivists who are still committed to the fact that perception can't be direct. There has to be a mediating factor within the brain somewhere.
So I think this ties
question
nicely. Huh?
That I forgot part two of the question.
It's all right. I mean, it happens. It's also late, and my brain works like that as well. I think because part of why I want to get on this direct perception element and trying to understand the mechanics a little bit, because I think that's where a lot of people struggle. Is like, okay, you say this word, but how does it actually work? How does it guide action? Because I'm going to slightly veer off here. So somebody had tweeted this out, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on it and how it relates to either cricket or baseball, because they're talking about this for baseball. They quoted somebody: "Perception is biased by things you have seen before." Richard Masland. To me, that makes sense. But how this person interpreted it, they followed up with saying, "Calibrate internal pitch models of your hitters." And so I think ecologically, we go, we're not, yes, our perception is biased by the things that we have seen before. I think that I think I can accept that, but I don't know it's about like calibrating my internal pitch model. So I guess how would you like understand that, or how would you respond to a coach who wants to increase who thinks that perception is about updating internal models and representations of the world? Because it very much feels like we're looking at the same data set, but we're interpreting it in some ways slightly two different ways. But like, you end up in very divergent ways of what you end up doing in training, if that's what you're trying to do. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on how you'd respond to that.
I mean, the new nihilist me would be like, I just let him crack on thinking like that, because this stuff's like politics, right? Some people, no one changes political party particularly easily. Like, and it's similar with this stuff. It's so deeply rooted in kind of how we view the world and like our internal epistemologies and ontologies that it feels like there's like an attraction to a particular way of viewing the world, and that aligns with ecological or cognitivist stuff. But to give an actual answer, there's a little bit that's just so rooted in language. So they're using the thought of a generative model of that pitch, which we're trying to build, and therefore the athlete can the stronger that model is, the better able that model is to be able to be adapted to different circumstances within the pitch. Like it makes logically kind of it sounds good. I guess the ecological version of that would be around attunement to the information which is available. So one of the issues we have, well, not issues, that's probably the wrong word, but in cricket in particular, there's a use of lots of bowling machines. So kind of big mechanical structures, you put the balls on the top, set the speed and set the direction, and I think some of them you can impart swing and spin on it as well. And you fire balls down to the batter. And there is some like very tangible stuff there, right? You're perceiving an object in flight, like it's just pretty similar to batting in a game. But this is where kind of that broader use of, I think, and particularly in my PhD, the marriage of sensory and non-sensory information, the marriage of kind of non-specifying with specifying information. I think perception is naturally using all of those forms of information every day. Like we're walking around the general world and we're always kind of using those bits of information. It's always part of our kind of visual and cognitive processes. So within cricket, we use lots of bowling machines that have very little additional information beyond the trajectory of the ball. And you could argue the trajectory of the ball isn't quite right as well, because you don't get that same kind of natural ball path that you get from bowlers and that kind of stuff. But and the way that bowling machines are used is that you'll give lots of consistent feeds at a particular length on a particular line, and you'll just kind of groove the technique of the batter, and you'll help them get really effective at making that shot, essentially to create a generative model in the brain. Whereas the argument on the flip side of that around the ecological approach would be you're just exposing them to kind of increasing levels of sensitivity to that information, and you're allowing them to explore the affordance landscape, if you want to use that term, or just explore the kind of the visual information that's available to them, and to be able to pick up what is specifying to inform their actions. So if we face the bowling machine really often, we get quite good at facing the bowling machine because we've learned the dynamics of that task, i.e. we've learned the information layout, the information structure. We've kind of become very sensitive to that particular optic array. Like I'm quite good against the bowling machine. I'm a pretty good batter. If you set it up on a pretty consistent length and line, I can get myself in a good bit of flow. Whereas an ecological version of that would be that you just learn task dynamics. We get very good at tasks that we learn, and transfer between tasks is actually quite difficult because we learn the information layout of particular settings. So take away the bowling machine, you're facing natural bowlers with all the other bits of information around it, which is essentially one of the PhD studies I'm doing, is facing bowlers just going through random deliveries, just whatever. Bowlers with a more pattern sequence, and bowlers with a set field, a context, a score, a scenario, and like increasing the levels of other information that might sit around that. And that for me is how we should be supporting athletes, is to make them as effective as possible as picking out of what is useful, or selecting the information which is most soliciting and kind of is going to allow them to exploit the affordances that are available within the environment. And I think that's what we've got to get athletes to, is that they've got to make really complex decisions under a lot of pressure with a load of different bits of information all over the place. Like the actual event of the delivery in baseball and cricket is such a minute amount of time. There's got to be more to it around that, which is supporting action. Like how much are we exposing athletes to sequences in delivery? How much are we exposing them to, like, so in cricket, you receive an over, so you receive 6 balls from the same bowler. How often are we actually exposing our batters to a bowler bowling 6 deliveries? Are we allowing them to kind of explore that bowler in a sequence and pick up on the bits of information which might support their action or might inform different parts? I've veered off quite significantly, I think, but to bring it back round to kind of the building of generative models, is that so we teach a module at Oxford Brookes where it's a coaching module around kind of creating practice designs, and we joint deliver it. So every week there's a broad theme, and I deliver it from like an ecological angle, and the other lecturer delivers it from a more cognitive angle, particularly around predictive processing. So we have our different use of terms, things like he's saying, we're building generative models here. I'm saying, well, actually just we're supporting them in, exploiting a landscape of affordances and attuning to X, Y, and Z. And we explain all these different things from our two different perspectives. But reality of it, most of our coaching looks quite similar. We both use, pretty similar looking environments. We'd like to keep things to be relatively representative of the performance environment. We're not a big fan of blocked repetitive practice. We both think athletes making decisions is a pretty good thing. Our coaching looks really similar. Our views of the world and our theoretical frameworks are very, very different. But ultimately, it gets us to the same kind of place on the pitch itself for different reasons. And there are always going to be bits where we veer off away from each other practically as well. But it's got me to this kind of point, which is why I don't really do Twitter anymore. Of like, do we need to worry that much about understanding the mechanics and the intricacies of different theoretical perspectives as coaches, and instead like just sharing some of the good principles and good practices that are available to us within coaching? I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it's worth exploring, because I have spent the past ultimately 10 years studying this stuff in a fair amount of depth and as part of my job. And even I've like barely scratched the surface, and I've probably got a pretty good grasp on it, but I don't know everything, and I don't know all the different bits. And, my mathematics isn't that strong, and my theory isn't the best in the world. And I've spent all this time studying it and I don't really know it. So is any coach kind of whose job is to be a coach, how much of this are they going to understand as well? And that's the kind of debate I've wrestled with lately. So I think as long as we can share in the good parts of our respective theories, and we're making informed decisions because we've kind of got a grasp of some stuff, maybe that's quite effective. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but the thought got in my head.
No, I mean, because the longer that I've been in this, I guess you could say, and then also practically trying to apply it with other coaches that aren't familiar with these concepts, the concept I play with is this idea of dexterity and adaptability. So if I understand, and two, like mastery, if you understand a concept well enough, you should be able to apply it across any different context that you find yourself in. And to me, if I'm just going from an ecological dynamics perspective, well, if I understand constraints and the constraint-led approach, and I understand how to manipulate constraints, it doesn't matter the situation. If I can understand the problem that we're trying to solve, then I can apply an ecological approach, even if the other person is applying, a blocked cognitive approach. I can still help athletes regardless, or just figure out how to navigate. And so to me, to your point, I'm getting that way too, of like, yeah, a lot of times the environments that we are putting our athletes in are very similar, but at times though, because I think if we're all doing the same environments, what is giving us an edge? Because I do think that's, trying to understand from an athletic performance standpoint, what is giving us an edge over our opponents, or what is going to help us better attune to what our athletes need. And I think that's where this stuff like really matters, of like, why should you care? Is trying to figure out like, how do we get more performance out of our athletes? And so that's at least my initial thought of kind of what you're talking about, is like, okay, yes, there is that whole element of people are not going to understand. It feels very religious, but at the same point, I do think if we wrestle with the questions, not necessarily trying to persuade the other person, but be able to answer it, because a lot of times we just take it for granted, like these ideas and these concepts, like, of course it's direct perception, but like the person who is resistant, they help us understand our position deeper to be able to articulate it better. And so at least for me, that's kind of how I've approached it. Because similarly, to you, I've been thinking about, like, interactions on social media of, well, why am I posting this? Why am I specifically trying to win an argument? But I also think there's something too of, like, being able to articulate better your position. So without necessarily crapping on everybody else. Like, I think that's an important thing, because then that, like, it just doesn't become super productive. But there's another thing that I wanted to kind of loop back into of, you're talking about pitching machines, and that's ubiquitous in baseball as well. One person that I've been interacting with on social media, who I've appreciated, has helped me understand some things. The way that he views it, and he wrote an article on Tau and all this sort of stuff, but he views it very much in this, I want to say, more mechanical sense of, like, it's all just about time. Time to contact is the only thing that matters. And I'm like, but it doesn't, like, because for him, he's like, well, I just need to use a pitching machine because Tau is the only thing that matters. So what's the difference? It's all the same. And in my head, I'm like, I don't have a good response, because even part of what you're just saying, like, well, if Tau is the specifying information and the ball is the specifying information in the ball flight, why wouldn't I just use a pitching machine? So I guess, what would you say to the person who sees it that way? To me, it makes sense why you would see it that way. All the things that we've been saying so far mostly sound like it affirms that. But what is the nuance that we're missing here?
I think it's the assumption that the event starts when the ball is released, and almost the ignorance to the fact that there is 20 seconds prior to ball release where loads of stuff is happening, right? Even, like, down to the point of, like, my knowledge of baseball is pretty limited, right? But the fact of someone trying to steal a base and that delaying the whole process of the pitch coming in, like, that's all part of it. Like, that's all part. And this is one of the things that's really frustrated me within skill acquisition research, is that just the treatment of all these different events as isolated things, and, like, taking away the fact that they're all so connected to each other. And look, it's a logical argument that, if all that matters is Tau, then yes, use pitching machines. But then we're asking people to perceive from complete static, like, nothingness, to then all of a sudden a ball flies at us. So then you bring the fact that, well, reaction time is then very much a thing, because, smooth pursuit tracking doesn't happen as easily as that. So the first few milliseconds are redundant, because we just don't see the ball fire out of the hole that quickly. So we've now lost part of the event to nothing. And then with the individuals, the batter is moving late. There was Ross Pinder's work in 2009, 2010 that looked at kind of movement kinematics when facing a bowler machine versus a live bowler. And we did something similar with visual search research in a project at Oxford Brookes. But essentially, like, the movement kinematics occur much later. The bat lift is much less when facing a bowler machine, because the whole response to the event itself comes much later. If you're facing a bowler, you can pick the ball very early on, and you can kind of smooth pursuit track the ball for a much longer period of the event, because you can see the ball's within your visual field. The second you use a bowler machine, that ball is occluded. And if you occlude the ball and it's out of the visual field, then all of a sudden, when it suddenly appears, it doesn't appear where we need it to appear, because you start to bring in other aspects to it. So that's the bit that gets me, is that batting isn't just relying on things like time to contact, because train the things you do. Like, if you're facing bowlers, train against bowlers. Now, there is an argument for it. Like, I shared an office with an S&C coach in my PhD, and we had this row, and, like, he doesn't have the overs to spend, or the pitches to spend in his bowlers in a week's training program. If he gets to, like, Thursday and his bowlers have spent their 20 overs for the week, and they've already spent 18 of them, and he's got 2 overs left in their tolerance for the next 4 days. Like, he's not letting them bowl in the nets that day. So maybe we might have to use the batting machine, and that's okay. I guess it's how do we encourage the bowling machine to become more representative and have more bits of kind of non-specifying information and more context attached to it and more of a purpose behind it. So if we're using the bowling machine because we can't use bowlers because we haven't got any, well, ideal world, could we kind of replicate some like the older, more traditional visual research studies, and could we get like a big white projector screen in front of it, and where the ball gets released from, can we cut out a hole in the screen there, and can we project videos of a bowler running in? So when they release the ball from their hand, it's actually the video ends with the release of the hand up here, and that's where the ball comes out of. Then you might get something more real. It might feel more like the game. Can we have fielding positions in place? Can we have a scenario? Can we add things which gives it a bit more game or kind of performance relevant information to support the use of that around the bowling machine? Because sometimes bowling machines are inevitable. Sometimes we can't escape them. In the winter, if a batter wants to kind of bat against a bowling machine because there's no bowlers around, like, that's fine. Absolutely fine. Like, why not? Batting against something rather than batting against nothing is probably still going to help us. I guess it's where, when we want to add value, if we're thinking about skill development specifically, then maybe we might have to make the decisions to incorporate more live elements. If our purpose is on skill development, let's get rid of the bowling machine. But if our purpose is on, I've got a batter that's really out of form, and they, so case in point, for the second study of my PhD, we added increasing bits of contextual information. So the first condition, they just batted like a normal net session. So bowlers just run in, bowl random deliveries. They're not really particularly thoughtful. They're just bowling them. Random sequence of bowlers, like the gaps like are pretty short. You just stood in the nets, just batting things away for ages. In that, batters are pretty comfortable. If you get out, you get out. Like, there's no real consequence to it. You just kind of get reset for the next delivery, which could be a spinner, it could be a seam bowler, it could be anything. Whereas when we started to add kind of context and pressure to it, and we said, well, now you're facing the same bowler for a full over, and you've also got to score 15 runs within that over. Like batters really struggled, and their batting mechanics got very rushed and very hampered, and chatting to them after, and it's quite speculative, but they're saying they felt so stressed, and they started having to chase a scoreboard. So they were timing shots much, much earlier because they were chasing after the ball a little bit. So all these bits of contextual information around it play such an important factor. So if our purpose is skill development, we've got to bring that stuff in. And that's where I'd say, well, then we've got to move bowling machines out, because, all right, yes, you get the ball trajectory and you get your time to contact stuff, but that's not batting. Batting is making use of all the different forms of information that exist, all the stuff in the build-up, the fact that the weather changes pitch to pitch, innings to innings, like all those different things are part of the batting experience. And the magic of the ecological approach is it's meant to be an embodied account of perception. The fact that it takes organism in its environment. And if we're going to appreciate that complexity in those relations, we've got to ensure that those relations are nested within any kind of training environment we try to create.
To that point, when you're talking about finding ways to infuse a little bit of, say, that more representativeness or non-specifying information into those practices, is there kind of like a rank order that you set up on things that you find most valuable? My mind goes to, what's a minimum effective mix of, okay, we have a pitching machine due to the constraint of being inside. What are the 2 to 3 variables that we want to add to this to be able to make it more effective for the development of skill?
I mean, there's no hierarchy of stuff. It's just try stuff and see what works. Like sometimes like space issues and time issues can dictate a lot of this stuff. So like I'm not really a cricket coach. A lot of this stuff just kind of comes from my understanding of like constraints and thinking, oh, how I can design stuff. So we used, I think the key one that we always use is fielding locations. And if that can be kind of replicated through like abstract objects, so there's a visual thing they can see. So in the nets, you've got like the actual nets that run alongside. And it might be like taping some A4 sheets of paper at various points along the nets to indicate there's a fielder within that line. Or it might be that we just we get a whiteboard, we put the field down on the whiteboard and say to the batter, well, this is the field. And we're going to change it after, if we feel like we would change it in a game as a bowler, we're going to change it. We'll tell you we've changed it and you can come see the board again and you can work out where your gaps are. I think that's the important thing for me because too often, like, batters go through the motions in their net sessions, just picking balls off and slapping shots and, they're middling it off the middle of the bat and it sounds good. But you've got no idea if they've not just middled it down like someone's throat who just, yeah, lovely, lovely catch. So give it some purpose and make them have to, I think it's really important that batting is more intentional. And I think that's the word that I guess I'd put into practice design is what we're doing intentional here? So I've got a batter, let's say, I'll take me as an example. Anything which is not kind of going way wide of my wickets, I'm crap. I can't hit to save my life. Anything coming anywhere near my stumps, like I'm guaranteed to get out. So for me, in my net sessions, I'd make sure that I set the bowler up to bowl lots of straight ones and say, that this batter, i.e. me, gets out very often to straight ones towards his stumps. So the bowler's then got an intention. The bowler's got an intention for how they're going to bowl. So straight away we've replicated some kind of performance environment. Then we might set up a field which deliberately prevents me from being able to play the shots I like. So if it's coming straight down at me, I might try and come across the line and play it off my legs and try and flick it round the corner. So what I'll do is I might make sure there's a, third man is up. And I might just try and play a slightly more heavy field on the leg side just to stop me from being able to play those shots because I know that I can keep doing it, but it's going to keep going to fielders, not going to get any runs for it. So I have to play straight. I have to play into the covers. So that's going to therefore encourage me and expose me to that more often. So I'm going to have to try and play those shots. And if I'm having to play those shots, I'm having to experience those shots. And that's only going to lead to, I'd argue, more learning because I'm being exposed to the thing that I'm bad at. I'm having to bat very intentionally because without the field positions, I just keep playing the same shot and just nick it off the legs and think, oh, I've done a nice one there. Oh, lovely. When in actual fact, I've just stuck it to another fielder. So I think making sure that the way that the bowlers, the batters, the pitchers, whatever we're calling them, that their behaviours are really intentional because their behaviours are going to be really intentional when it comes to the game in 4 days' time. So if training can therefore be and obviously there's other stuff like if we're game day -1, I'm probably not going to want overly burdensome practice designs with loads of decisions that are quite tiring. There's some nuance to this and there's some clever programming and just good coaching stuff. I'm not going to want to stress the life out of my batters the day before a game. So it might be, if we're playing Saturday, on the Friday, I might get the bowling machine out because it's nice and easy. They get in their groove. They can just go knock a few balls around, feel good. Because I know that on Wednesday, Thursday, they're facing environments that are really intentional and creating a bit of stress and a bit of anxiety and feels a bit more like the game itself. And that's where my learning's taking place. And Friday maybe is more about maintenance and making sure they're feeling good, ready for the game the next day. So I think sometimes, and I've been really guilty for this as well, is forgetting that there's more to more to coaching than just the skill acquisition bit. There is like a person on the end of all of this who has kind of thoughts and feelings, and as much as as coaches, sometimes we wish they didn't and they were just robots who did the things we want them to do. Like it's not the case, and I think skill development is super holistic, and I think that's where we get value from the ecological approach.
Well, and that was kind of where, to me, if you truly appreciate ecological dynamics and the constraint-led approach, you have to consider the person and their psychological state in some ways, but not. Yeah, I think psychological state is the right way to put it. But I think that then plays into what you were talking about in your research currently of skilled intentionality. I think because our intentions might shift as we're interacting with things, and going back to talking about, you applied more context to the practice environment, all of a sudden their behavior changed. And so that shifted their intentions. I think, to me, so this is where I'm curious, how would you define skilled intentionality? What is kind of the abstract view of this theory, or this concept? And then I kind of want to play with it a little bit, but at least I think we need to start there and not assume that my understanding is correct. I want to, or just have people assuming and then potentially us being wrong, like on specifying information.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a textbook definition of skilled intentionality handy, but like, initially I wasn't a massive fan of the skilled intentionality stuff. But I got proper excited with it the last couple of years. It could just fit. It suited the data. It suited my project so nicely. But I guess skilled intentionality is like the skilled use of that landscape of affordances. Like, and if we view affordances and our relations to them, and actually view affordances as existing within relations, and if we view that as being really nested and occurring over lots of different timescales, and not necessarily just being the thing in front of me that I perceive. So right now, the example that got used quite a lot was like, I can't directly perceive like the can of beer in my fridge. I can't see it, but I know it's there. And I also know that like the need like for me to like quench thirst, i.e. the affordance is the beer can in the fridge, but I can't see it, but I can still perceive the fact that it exists and it has value to me and that it affords me the possibility to drink. So skilled intentionality answers those more representation hungry questions, like it answers the questions like where we are having to do some thinking about objects which are not currently in front of us. Like, I'm sat in my living room, I'm not in my kitchen, I can't even see the fridge, but I know the fridge is there. I know that if I open the fridge, there is a can of beer. So how do those kind of more bigger meta problems get solved? And skilled intentionality essentially aims to answer those questions. The fact that how does an individual skillfully navigate that landscape of affordances and like kind of satisfy the relations we have with the environment. So in a cricket context, it would be very much like in cricket, you could bat for the entire game. So unless you get out or you declare, you could find yourself batting for like an entire 8-hour day, and you being the person out there, keep facing the balls, or your partner at the other end. So I really liked the use of skilled intentionality in that sense, in the fact that it can be a nice framework to address the real temporal nature of batting, the fact that this happens over a really long time. So the work that I presented the other month with Sean and Tyler was looking at, so we interviewed with like a video stimulated interview. So we got the highlights from the game they played 2 days before, sat down with each batter and like just reflected and chatted about different events and different moments within the highlights. So some of the batters' innings lasted like 2 hours, 3 hours. Some of the batters like lost their wicket after like 3 deliveries. So the interviews are really different in length, and therefore their reflections are really different. And one of the batters was like, "Oh, I think," she was like, "I think of nothing. Like, there's nothing going through my head when I'm batting. I'm just singing a Boy's Own song." And like her entire innings, like she's quite a young player, score like 50 or 60 or something. But it was like, I have no recollection of anything. She was like, I was just singing a song. I was like, because I know if I wasn't singing a song, then I'd been really frantic. But then other players were like really thoughtful. I'm like, like I remember this ball. I thought she was going to swing it away, but then it nipped back in on me, and I had to get down to it late and had to play it on the back foot. Like, I just had really detailed answers, and it just made me think that like the levels of intentionality, the different ways these batters are using information, like there's something really unique and individual in all of this. And essentially, I think corresponds with the use of like a landscape of affordances. The fact that some batters are more skilled at doing that. Some batters have found a way to be skilled at using less of those affordances. So I think stemming back to that use of like more kind of sensory and non-sensory information, some batters were very aware of the non-sensory stuff, like the scout reports, the scoreboard, all those things that kind of are information in and of themselves, but not necessarily specifying in any way. Some batters were really aware of that, and that was quite an integral part of their shot selection. Whereas some batters were like, yeah, no idea. Like, I didn't even look at the score. Like, I was just thinking about what I was going to have for lunch. So all these different variations, and it fitted really nicely with the quiet eye work we published a couple of years ago, in the fact that when you stop generalizing participant data to a mean score, you actually start to see these real unique variations in performance. So both within individuals and like between individuals. So, a group of 4, each one of those 4 had slightly different like quiet eye profiles, i.e. how they perceived the kind of the key critical bit of information, like differed quite vastly. But then also within those individuals themselves, there was variation from trial to trial. So this for me just corresponds with that, but on just like an additional level, on this like intentionality level, the fact that intentions might be the thing that shapes perception of different events. The hard bit is going to be how do I actually evidence that? Because, we can't conclusively say, like, we can't see direct perception. Like, if you'd forgive the irony of it, like, we can't see a representation. We can see a series of like neural networks and firing neurons. And some people have assumed that means that's a representation, and some people have assumed that's just resonance. Like, we can't see this stuff. So that's the difficulty. But I think, that's kind of skilled intentionality I've tried to explain.
You brought up a couple of different things that I wanted to touch on. I wanted to go at least to stay on intentionality, but I do want to touch on resonance. So to me, intentionality is like a lens by which like you filter what information you're going to either pick up or how you aim to interact with that information. And so I feel like, because when you change the task dynamics, you apply, you put in fielders and then you give a consequence potentially, or you give them a goal of scoring 15 runs. All of a sudden now the way that you aim to interact changes. But I think there's something to the notion of being skillful in picking out or deciding on or what your intention is, right? So like a more skilled batter is able to pick an intention that is going to match what they need to do. A less skilled batter may pick a different intention that is not going to functionally fit with the task. And so because to me, when I'm thinking about from a practice design standpoint, the reason that why I want these potentially more difficult scenarios or that have different bits or slices of the game is so that they can begin to attune to what type of intentions are most successful, because they can also become hyper focused on things that are, you could say, not specifying. And that's where I your whole definition of specifying information is just kind of like, in some ways, like blown my mind a little bit, because now how do you delineate, in my mind, like there's information that's valuable versus information that is like, um, it is, in the word of like contextual interference, like it interferes with you being able to connect. And I think there's a difference between, to me, how I was defining specifying information it just had to be relevant. It was something that is useful for the task versus a lawful thing. So that I'm curious, at least on that point, like, is there a way to delineate things that are non-specifying and non-useful? Is that how you would have to term it? Or, specifying or non-specifying and useful, like that's where I guess, on a side tangent, I'm
I mean,
I'm kind of curious now.
there's some nice stuff from a guy called Ollie Runswick, his work is actually based in like the predictive processing stuff, but looked at like when contextual information is incongruent with the actual actions. So it was in cricket, and when the field positions don't align to the type of ball that's been bowled. So in cricket, you'll bowl certain types of balls based on your field positions because that's more likely to get them out. But oftentimes, like wickets batters have lost their wicket to a delivery which they weren't expecting because they might have weighted too much of their focus on the contextual information around the field and may have kind of preempted a kind of delivery, and then at that ball when it hasn't come. So potentially, like there is the point of information becoming or stopping being as useful as it could be. I guess it's based on like the weighting of how that information is used, which I think is what comes back to the fact that, if we're going to train in training environments, we've got to make sure this stuff is available to the batters to be able to search through and search for to find out what is going to be supportive of action. Yeah, in terms of delineating what's useful and what's not, it's just really difficult, and I don't think we know. We can't know for certain that what they do in their run up is for good or for evil. In the same way that, so kinematics are talked about a lot in the visual search research, particularly around like when we're perceiving someone throwing a projectile. But then a lot of the cricketers we spoke to in the stimulated recall interviews paid very little attention to what the bowler was doing kinematically. So there is this disconnect in kind of how people use information. Like there is some, just because we put eye trackers on someone and that their retinas are moving towards different parts of the body, does that mean their intention or their attention is actually placed there? And it's more of a question thrown up in the air more than any like making a point on anything. But I don't think we know is basically the point I'm trying to make, and that we are trying to generate an idea of this stuff. But for one batter, something might be useful. For another batter, it might not be. I think that's the point of the skilled intentionality, is that the purpose of it in the bowler sense, in those kind of intentions, is to keep as many potential affordances open until as late as possible, so that selection can come much later, i.e. through using non-specifying information in the bowler's gather and run up. I'm positioning myself to make use of as many different affordances as possible, for when more specifying information is available, I can then select the appropriate, or select is the wrong word there, but I can make a more effective action to intercept the ball and kind of put it into a certain area.
I guess the other thing I wanted to explore is, the one gal who she just had a song kind of going in her head. To me, this I think plays a little bit towards the question of resonance. What I got from ecological dynamics is this sense that our system will use information and coordinate based upon that information. We might not even be consciously aware of it. So, for example, how previous, to that quote, how previous events will bias us towards the coming events. Well, if I am singing a song and I'm not letting that information overly, I don't get overly fixated on it, but rather because right, in some ways we're really good at picking up patterns, and it becomes intuitive, right? We intuit the pattern before we can fully articulate the thing that we're seeing sometimes. And so I guess where I'm going is how much does it matter, except for like kind of, trying to puzzle it out later. What a person is necessarily saying. Cause like in that example, like, because this is why, for example, when I hear a player talk about let's go, some of the research that I've looked at with gaze behavior in hitters is that some hitters or like novice hitters will look at parts of the body that expert hitters tend not to, right? Like if you're still looking at the chat or the lead arm or whatever, when the hand starts to come out, okay, maybe you're not looking in the right area. But if you are successful and you're looking at an area that doesn't seem to make sense, that tells me that like, oh, maybe you're using the periphery. You're better at picking out periphery information and utilizing it that way versus looking directly and having like your focal point being there. And so I think that's kind of, to me, my understanding of like part of what we're trying to do with direct perception is open the system up to be able to fully connect with the information there and not cloud it with something else and like hone in on information that's not useful. And I'm curious on this because Rob Gray talked about this of, when we use a batting or a pitching machine, we can become attuned to non-specifying information, or we can develop a relationship with it that doesn't actually translate to the the game context with an actual pitcher. So how do you look at that as far as like, are they attuning to non-specifying information when they're hitting off of a bowling machine and that's why it's not transferring? But if we're talking about like towel being there, there's still the same specifying information. So I guess what is it? Do you have a different way of explaining that than how Rob was talking about it?
Without knowing the context that Rob was talking about it in, I'm not sure. I'd be a brave man to go up against Rob anyway. He's the authority in this space. Yeah, I wouldn't want to go up again. I wouldn't know the context in which Rob was talking about, because in my like the ball trajectory itself is an information variable that is specifying some kind of action. The non-specifying stuff in terms of the fact that it's a bowling machine and that there is no run up and that there's no, you can't perceive the release point. In that sense, the fact that that kind of non-specifying information isn't there, and therefore you're picking up on non-specifying information in the sense of the machine itself. And so in cricket, when you use the bowling machine, the person like operating the machine will hold the ball in their hand, put their arm directly up in the air, and then feed the machine. So in that sense, like if they're attuning to that action as a trigger for the ball is about to be released, like that's maybe attuning to a non-specifying information source which will not transfer effectively. So in that sense, if there's a similar mechanism within a baseball pitching machine, in the sense that if they are picking up on information from the person operating the machine, or in the sense that there is a lag time or a delay time between ball to ball, if it's like an auto firing machine, picking up of that information, which probably isn't conducive for performance, even it translates into the actual the game itself.
I guess my last kind of question is, what are your thoughts on resonance? When it comes to how we become attuned to things, like, because to me it's all about the pickup of information, and then you know and then to me you don't necessarily need to be able to fully articulate it, because to me resonance and attunement like allow for more of an embodied sort of like direct interaction with the information. But I don't really know like the full mechanisms of it, just other than like you become sensitive to the information, you're able to pick it up faster, you'll be able to like, I don't know, again, kind of like a radio wave, right? Like it's matching pitch in terms of like tone or frequency. Um and so that's where I see like the difference between like information processing, versus attunement and resonance. Like that to me seems to be a more, I don't know, direct or analog way of interacting with the world.
Yeah, I mean, t- the resonance stuff comes from like the metaphor of that Gibson used of like a radio transmitter, and the fact that it is like resonating to the signals that then generate like the noise essentially. But I've really struggled with that resonance metaphor because like
Because
it. Go on, go for it.
oh well, because when I looked into the concept of resonance, right, like things have, for example, metal has a frequency that it resonates at. And what it when you look at like, well, what does that mean? It means that for the input in, it actually will like double or something, right? Like, so for the same amount of input, you're actually getting more. And so I almost wonder if like, when something resonates with you, all of a sudden it gives you more energy, you connect with it, you're drawn towards it. And so to me, that's kind of how I understand the concept of resonance or attunement. Like you are drawn towards this thing. And so like, for example, to become more attuned and sensitive to the information that's going to help you most functionally execute the task, that's kind of like, to me, the whole purpose of practice is like you become these things become more intuitive. um it, like, just in the way that with a somebody who has mastered something, things become really simple, right? Like all this, the things that would bog down a novice, it's like, well, based upon the constraints of the situation, I'm able to hone in very simply, to me, on this kind of notion of like higher order variables. There's higher order things that kind of like prioritize, and I understand what the priorities are, and like I'm able to hone in very simply based upon these like simple concepts. And so I don't know, that's for me at least how I'm trying to, or how I view like attunement, resonance. Like these things, all of a sudden they give you more energy. They draw you in to the thing, and I think that's also related to affordances. Why do we accept some affordances versus other affordances?
Yeah, as a post hoc explanation, I can see the logic in that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like resonance traditionally was around like the uh, resonance between like the information and like the neural signals essentially, like
Mm-hmm.
the essentially like the corresponding frequency of the information variables and how that is then picked up by the perceptual system. And then there's some stuff around like oscillating frequencies, which then goes a little bit beyond me. But yeah, my PhD supervisor always asks me, he's always like, well, like what actually is attunement? Like, what is it? And like, it's always like like becomes like a metaphysical like debate about what attunement actually is. And I'm still not convinced that I've provided a sound enough answer, because you end up falling back on other metaphors like resonance, for example. But yeah, so resonance, I've always found it is a bit of a tricky sticking point in the theory, but as like a metaphor, it does nicely explain essentially the mechanics of direct perception, in the sense that if there is resonance between the frequency of the information variables and how we are picking them up, then there is going to be like a corresponding relation between myself and that information. So as a metaphor, I like it. In terms of mechanics, I'm still trying to get my head around it.
That's fair. I think that's a kind of a, unless AJ, do you have anything, or Robert, do you have anything that you want to, any other questions you want to ask before we wrap it up?
No, I don't got anything because I think the question I wanted to ask was regarding the resonance, and you asked it, Garrett.
Yeah, I have one more just to wrap us up. It'll be quick, but what's one thing that you think batters should be doing more of that most currently aren't, that you've seen in your research?
Batting. Like, actually just spend some time batting. That's a bit flippant, but I'm on like the peripheries of this stuff from just like seeing a few things on like social media, and see a lot of time like batters like doing a lot of stuff on like the shape of their like bat path, and similar to golfers, like spending so much time on their swing and forgetting that there's actually a ball they've got to hit at some point, and that there's like another person like a fair few meters away who's trying to stop you from having that ideal bat path, and they're going to throw it to disrupt that bat path. So why not spend some time making that bat path more like, or like I'm using flippant terms, but like why not spend more time developing like dexterity and that adaptability and the ability to really tightly couple perception and action. And I've seen some cricketers with lovely batting mechanics, like they like their shots look good, but anything which is outside of their wheelhouse, any delivery which has got like a little bit of shape to it, and like they fall apart. And some of the best batters I've seen have been like some of the most unconventional, ugliest batters, but they are ultimately, you are, as a batter in any sport, you are judged on your ability to make bat on ball contacts consistently, cleanly and effectively. And if it looks like, if it looks baggy, then it looks baggy. Like who's really caring when the ball's like clearing the boundary? Like, so yeah, I just think like let's just allow batters to spend a bit more time actually batting and coupling perception and action.
Yeah, that's a great little quote to wrap it up. It's, if you want to get better at batting, bat more.
I guess on a practical note, then, what are some ways to do that? Like, for example, in my mind, like, you talked about, because I mean, you're talking about batters, but let's flip it. Let's talk about like pitchers and bowlers, right? Like, I don't know, like, would it not be just as efficacious for them to pitch to hitters more? And then because to me, that's where where this practically goes is like, I don't know, if you're working on hitting, you need a pitcher present, and vice versa. Like, if a pitcher only has so much volume, that they can throw in a day, a good portion of that, if not all of it, should be to a hitter. Like, to me, that just makes sense. And so, because then you can kind of then supplement, like you're saying, with a pitching machine later. But I think that to me is the ideal, and I think more people should try to figure out that process, because I think it's the same way of like, if you're gonna do martial arts or whatever, like you can't really learn how to wrestle if you don't wrestle against somebody else. Like, so that's at least my thought process there. I don't know, Ben, if you have any other thoughts on practically how to logistically make that work.
It's all just come back down to intentions, really. Like the same thing. I'm a pretty good bowler when it comes to bowling at the nets, and there's no batter involved. Like I look half good. when the intentions change and all of a sudden you're not just trying to like hit the wickets, you're trying to navigate a person who's trying to smash the ball away. Like that becomes a very different bowling becomes a very different experience. And yeah, I think it's just around like setting those intentions, and whether that comes very literally in the design of our practice, or maybe more kind of subtly in our instructions and interactions we have with the batters and bowlers. Like, are we giving our performers instructions within training that shapes their intentions? Are we saying to them like, in training tomorrow, maybe I might ask my batter to, when you're in your batting group tomorrow, just go after it. Just try and score as big as you can. Are we like allowing them to kind of be shaped by those different intentions? So when it comes down to it, like potentially we might be able to get those elements to transfer into the performance environment if they're more exposed to batting with that particular set of intentions. But yeah, I think ultimately, Garrett, your points there, like batters and bowlers, like get them set up together.
What types of resources would you recommend to people? It doesn't even have to be ecological dynamics or whatever, just anything that you think would be good and helpful for people, resources. And then two, where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Only because it's a lot of what I'm reading at the moment, like anything by people like Oliver Ranswick, Sean Muller, like those kind of guys, just wicked research that's not framed ecologically, but just answering some like really, really good questions. And where you can find me, I'm on Twitter, but I'm not on it a lot, or not as much as I used to be. And I can't remember what my @ is. I've forgotten now. I think it's like
let's see.
Ben
I mean,
underscore.
I can throw it in the in the
terrible. I'm terrible at
comments
branding.
here.
Clearly.
It doesn't matter. Social media is overrated, right? Let's see. It's Ben_Franks1.
There we go.
So, all right. Well, thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And until next time, everybody.